My son kicked me out during a Chicago blizzard when the thermometer hit 12 below zero. 3 days later, scientists discovered my blood was worth $8 million. I'm Kimberly Rodriguez, 66 years old, and I'm about to tell you how the worst week of my life became my greatest revenge. For 32 years, I'd been the kind of employee companies claim to value, but rarely do. I worked in logistics at a Naperville firm. Perfect attendance, every holiday shift covered, every deadline met. Then one Friday afternoon, they handed me a cardboard box and a cold handshake. Just like that, 3 decades meant nothing. The drive back to the Lincoln Park house I helped pay for felt endless. My son Brandon, 37, had always been ambitious, but since marrying Ashley, that ambition had curdled into something uglier. I'd become the free childcare for Leo and Chloe, the financial cushion propping up a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. When I told them about losing my job, Brandon's face went from shock to calculation in seconds. He informed me they'd just refinanced counting on my monthly contribution. Ashley appeared from the kitchen, ice in her voice, saying if I couldn't pay my share, there was no point in me occupying the master suite. The next day brought one of the decade's worst snowstorms. Brandon walked into my room with 2 suitcases already packed. He told me I should stay with my sister in Indiana for a while, knowing full well she was traveling. He'd already called an Uber to take me to the bus station. He put me out in a blizzard. I stood on that sidewalk watching the lights go dark in a house where I'd invested my entire retirement savings. What Brandon didn't know was that Lake Michigan winds weren't the coldest thing I'd faced that week. And they definitely weren't going to be the most valuable. Want to know what happened next? Hit that subscribe button and settle in, because this story is just getting started. The municipal shelter on South State Street was packed beyond capacity. The blizzard had driven dozens of people indoors, and I found myself on a cot, squeezed between a woman who coughed all night and a man muttering in his sleep. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, never quite turning off, and the smell of too many bodies in too little space made my stomach turn. I'd lived through a lot in 66 years, but I'd never imagined I'd end up here. My phone had died somewhere between the bus station and the shelter entrance. I had $43 in my wallet and the clothes in those 2 suitcases Brandon had so thoughtfully packed for me. He'd forgotten my medications, naturally. Those were probably still sitting on my bathroom counter in the house I'd helped buy. The first night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's face when he'd told me about the refinancing. There'd been no apology in his expression, no recognition that I'd sacrificed everything to help him build his life, just irritation that I'd become inconvenient. On the second day, a volunteer doctor made rounds through the shelter. Dr. Sarah Vance from the University of Chicago was conducting a research study on genetic markers in at-risk populations. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and seemed genuinely interested when she explained her project. She asked if I'd be willing to provide a blood sample for her research. I figured I had nothing left to lose. My arm was already bruised from carrying those heavy suitcases through the snow. What was one more needle? Dr. Vance drew several vials, labeled them carefully, and thanked me for participating. She mentioned that all participants would receive a small stipend for their time, $25. I remember thinking that $25 meant I could buy decent food for a few days instead of relying on the shelter meals. The third day was when everything shifted. Dr. Vance returned, but she wasn't alone. She'd brought another researcher and a hospital administrator, and the 3 of them asked if we could speak privately. We ended up in a small office that the shelter director used for counseling sessions. The doctor's hands were actually shaking as she opened a folder containing my test results. She explained that they'd run an expanded panel on my sample, something they did randomly with certain participants. What they'd found was extraordinary. I had what's called Rh null blood, she told me, the rarest blood type in the world. But that wasn't even the remarkable part. My blood contained a specific mutation in antibodies that researchers had been trying to isolate for years. This particular combination could be the key to developing a treatment for a rare form of childhood leukemia that had a survival rate of less than 15%. I sat there in that cramped office, trying to process what she was telling me. My blood, the same blood currently keeping me alive in a homeless shelter, might save children's lives. But there was more. A technology billionaire whose 8-year-old grandson had been diagnosed with this exact form of leukemia had established a research fund. He'd been working with Northwestern Memorial Hospital and had put out what Dr. Vance called a universal call for compatible donors. The compensation for someone willing to commit to regular plasma donations and allow their blood to be used in developing the treatment was substantial. She quoted a number: $8 million. I made her repeat it 3 times. $8 million for exclusive rights to my plasma over the next 5 years, with guaranteed medical care, housing during donation periods, and complete legal protection. The hospital administrator started talking about contracts, about how quickly they could move, about getting me into a private recovery suite. Dr. Vance kept apologizing for the shock, asking if I needed water, if I understood what they were telling me. I understood perfectly. 3 days ago, my own son had deemed me worthless because I'd lost a job. He'd calculated my value in terms of monthly rent contributions and free babysitting. He'd put a 66-year-old woman out in a snowstorm because I was no longer profitable to him. Now these strangers were telling me my blood could save a child's life and was worth more money than Brandon would see in 10 lifetimes of his corporate middle management position. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd frozen on a sidewalk in Lincoln Park while the most valuable substance Brandon would ever know ran warm through my veins. Dr. Vance asked if I needed time to think about it, to consult with family or a lawyer. I looked at the condensation on the office window, at the gray Chicago sky beyond, and thought about my son's face when he'd packed those suitcases. I told her I didn't need time. I had no family to consult. As for lawyers, the hospital could provide those, and I'd read every word before I signed. Within 6 hours, I was in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, warm for the first time in 3 days. A team of specialists explained the donation process while lawyers went through contracts line by line. I signed everything. And then I let them take the first donation of my $8 million blood. The recovery suite at Northwestern Memorial felt like a 5-star hotel compared to that shelter cot. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, and the bed had sheets with a thread count I'd never experienced in my life. A private nurse checked on me every few hours, monitoring my vitals after the first plasma donation. The medical team treated me like I was made of gold, which, in a sense, I was. Dr. Vance visited twice daily, excited about the initial results. The billionaire's grandson, a boy named Marcus, had received his first treatment within 18 hours of my donation. Early indicators showed his body responding positively to the antibodies. I was saving a child's life with something I'd been born with, something I'd carried through 66 years without knowing its value. While my vitals stabilized and my body recovered from the donation, lawyers worked on establishing the fund transfers. The hospital had connected me with a wealth management firm, the kind of operation that handled trusts for Chicago's old money. On my 5th day in the hospital, a financial advisor named Patricia Chen walked me through what $8 million actually meant. She showed me portfolio projections, tax implications, investment strategies. The hospital administration had negotiated a payment structure: $2 million upfront, with the remaining $6 million dispersed over the contract period. Even with taxes, I'd never have to worry about money again. Patricia helped me set up accounts, explained asset protection, and advised me to say nothing to anyone until everything was legally secured. She'd seen cases where family members came out of nowhere when sudden wealth appeared. She suggested I wait until the first transfer cleared before making any announcements. I took her advice. But Chicago has a way of spreading news faster than Lake Michigan spreads ice in winter. On day 7, a local reporter somehow got wind of the story. A human interest piece appeared in the Tribune. Homeless woman's rare blood saves dying child. They'd kept my name out of it initially, but the medical community in Chicago is smaller than people think. By day 9, my full name was in the Sun-Times, along with a photograph someone had taken of me leaving the hospital for a follow-up appointment. Kimberly Rodriguez, the $8 million donor, read the headline. My phone, which I'd finally charged and reactivated, started buzzing within an hour of that article going live. Text messages from numbers I hadn't seen in years, calls from distant cousins I barely remembered. Former co-workers from the logistics company suddenly remembered how much they'd valued my friendship. But the call I'd been waiting for came on day 10. Brandon. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to his message 3 times, analyzing every word the way I used to analyze shipping manifests. His voice was warm, concerned, dripping with an emotion that almost sounded genuine. He told me he'd been worried sick, that he'd gone to the shelter looking for me, that there'd been a terrible misunderstanding during the blizzard. He claimed the stress of the storm had made him act irrationally. He wanted me to come home. Ashley had even bought new furniture for my room as an apology. The performance was impressive. I'd give him that. The second voicemail came an hour later. This time, Ashley was on the line with him. She mentioned Leo and Chloe, how much the kids missed their grandmother, how they cried asking when I'd come back. She suggested we could all sit down as a family and discuss what had really happened during that unfortunate incident. By the afternoon, they'd sent flowers to the hospital. Expensive ones. The kind that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. The card was signed by all 4 of them, complete with crayon drawings from the kids. I held those drawings and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my resolve. That was solid as the frozen Lake Michigan shoreline. What cracked was the last small part of me that had wanted to believe Brandon might actually be sorry, that he might care about something beyond my suddenly valuable blood. Patricia Chen stopped by that evening for a routine check-in on the financial arrangements. She saw the flowers and the card and immediately understood. She told me a story about her own sister, who'd won a malpractice settlement years ago. Her sister's husband, who'd been talking about divorce, suddenly became the most devoted spouse imaginable, until the money ran out. Then he left anyway, taking half of what remained. Patricia pulled out her tablet and showed me options for asset protection. Trusts that couldn't be touched by family members. Legal structures that would ensure my wealth stayed mine. She mentioned that the hospital had relationships with the best estate attorneys in Illinois. I asked her about setting up a trust fund for Leo and Chloe, something that couldn't be accessed until they turned 25, with explicit conditions preventing their parents from touching a single cent. Something that would give my grandchildren a future their father couldn't gamble away, or Ashley couldn't spend on whatever luxury brand she was currently obsessing over. Patricia smiled. She told me she could have documents ready within 48 hours. That night, lying in my hospital bed with Lake Michigan dark beyond the windows, I made a decision. Brandon wanted his mother back now that her blood had turned to liquid gold. He'd get to see me all right. But he was going to learn that some things, once frozen, never quite thaw the same way. Brandon showed up at the hospital exactly when I told him he could visit. 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, giving me time to prepare. I'd asked the nursing staff to make my room look more clinical than comfortable, to emphasize the medical nature of my situation. Patricia Chen had briefed me on what to listen for, what questions to ask, how to let them reveal themselves. When Brandon walked through that door carrying another bouquet, I saw calculation in his eyes before he remembered to arrange his face into concern. Ashley followed 2 steps behind, and I noticed her gaze sweeping the room, probably pricing the private suite in her head, estimating what kind of insurance or payment covered this level of care. Brandon tried to hug me, and I let him, feeling the tension in his shoulders that betrayed his nerves. He told me how relieved he was to find me safe, how he'd been devastated when I disappeared into the storm. Ashley made sympathetic noises while perching on the edge of the visitor's chair, her designer bag placed carefully where I couldn't miss seeing the logo. I played my part. I told them the plasma donations left me tired, that the doctors were still monitoring my recovery, that the whole situation felt overwhelming. I mentioned being confused by all the legal documents, struggling to understand what the lawyers kept explaining about trusts and disbursements and tax implications. That's when Ashley leaned forward, her voice taking on that particular tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone slow. She offered to help me sort through the paperwork, said she had experience with financial matters from her brief stint working at a bank before she married Brandon. She suggested it might be easier if she and Brandon handled the complicated parts so I wouldn't have to stress about it. Brandon jumped in immediately, saying how much sense that made. He reminded me that he'd always been good with numbers, that he had a business degree after all. He painted a picture of us working together as a family, making smart decisions about my future. Their future. Our collective future, he called it. I asked what they thought I should do with the money. Ashley's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting for this exact question. She started talking about investments in property, mentioning a development project near Lake Forest that Brandon's colleague had recommended. She described a compound-style estate where we could all live together, where the kids would have space to grow, where I'd have my own wing with around-the-clock care. Brandon added details about security systems and staff quarters, about how the property would appreciate in value, about legacy planning for Leo and Chloe. He made it sound generous, like they'd thought of everything. I asked how much this property cost. $3.2 million, Brandon said, like that was a reasonable number to spend on a house. He explained that if we leveraged the initial $2 million payment I'd receive, we could finance the rest, and the monthly mortgage would easily be covered by the remaining disbursements from my contract. Ashley mentioned renovations they'd want to do, upgrades to make everything perfect. She estimated another $500,000 for those improvements. She was already decorating rooms in her imagination, assigning spaces, planning where her furniture would go. Then Brandon said something that made my blood run cold, despite the warm hospital room. He mentioned that given my age and the stress I'd been under, it might make sense to establish power of attorney, just in case the donations affected my health or cognitive function, just to make sure someone trustworthy could make decisions if I became unable to do so myself. Just as a precaution, he emphasized, though his eyes said something different. Ashley agreed immediately, saying it was the responsible thing to do, that I shouldn't have to carry such burden alone. She mentioned a lawyer they'd already consulted, someone who could draw up the documents quickly. I let the silence stretch between us. Then I asked who would hold this power of attorney. Brandon said he would, naturally. He was my son, my only child, the logical choice. Ashley placed her hand on his arm in a show of united support. I looked at my son and saw a stranger wearing my child's face. I saw someone who'd stood in that Lincoln Park house 10 days ago and handed me suitcases during a blizzard. Someone who'd calculated my worth in rent payments and babysitting hours. Someone who was now calculating how quickly he could get his hands on $8 million. I told them I needed time to think about everything, that it was all happening so fast, that my head hurt from the donation side effects. I made myself sound weaker than I felt, more uncertain than I was. Brandon patted my hand like I was a confused elderly relative, not the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. He told me not to worry, that he'd take care of everything, that I should just focus on resting and recovering. Ashley gathered her expensive bag and promised they'd come back tomorrow to discuss things further. She suggested I shouldn't make any major decisions without consulting them first. After they left, I sat in that hospital bed and finally let myself smile. They'd shown me exactly who they were. Now I could show them exactly who I'd become. The estate attorney Patricia Chen recommended arrived the next morning. Her name was Margaret Stone, and she'd been practicing law in Chicago for 38 years. She specialized in protecting assets from predatory family members, and Patricia told me Margaret had seen every manipulation tactic in existence. Margaret spread documents across the hospital bed table and didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked me direct questions about Brandon and Ashley's visit, about what they'd proposed, about their mention of power of attorney. I told her everything, including Brandon's comment about my cognitive function. Margaret's expression never changed, but she made notes in shorthand that covered 3 pages of her legal pad. When I finished, she explained exactly what Brandon had been attempting. The power of attorney, combined with the property purchase and shared finances, would have essentially given him control over my assets while leaving me legally obligated for debts he'd incur. The cognitive function comment was laying groundwork to potentially declare me incompetent if I resisted. She asked if I wanted to fight back or simply protect myself. I chose both. Margaret outlined a strategy over the next 2 hours. First, we'd secure my assets in a revocable trust with me as trustee, making it impossible for anyone to access or control my wealth without my explicit approval. Second, we'd establish the trust fund for Leo and Chloe with ironclad terms that prevented parental access. Third, we'd draft a letter documenting the timeline of events, from my dismissal from work through Brandon expelling me during the blizzard, creating a legal record of what had actually happened. But Margaret suggested something else, something that addressed the anger I'd been carrying since that night on the Lincoln Park sidewalk. She'd noticed that Brandon still legally owned the house I'd helped purchase. My name wasn't on the deed, despite thousands of dollars I'd contributed to the down payment and monthly expenses. Margaret asked if I had any documentation of those payments. I'd kept every bank statement, every canceled check, every receipt for 30 years. It was a habit from my logistics career, tracking every transaction, maintaining records. They were in a storage unit I'd been paying for monthly, the one place Brandon couldn't access. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. She explained that my financial contributions, properly documented, could be argued as creating an implied partnership or loan arrangement. While I couldn't force ownership transfer, I could potentially claim reimbursement for my investment with interest, especially given Brandon's recent refinancing that excluded me from any equity benefit. The sum, she calculated, would be substantial, possibly enough to put Brandon underwater on his new mortgage. I authorized her to proceed with everything. Over the next 3 days, Margaret's firm worked faster than I'd thought possible. The trust was established and funded with the initial $2 million that had just transferred. The account for Leo and Chloe was created with specific terms. They'd receive equal payments starting at age 25, contingent on them maintaining steady employment or enrollment in education with strict prohibitions against their parents serving as trustees or accessing funds for any reason. Margaret also connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in reconstructing financial histories. I gave him access to my storage unit, and he spent 2 days reviewing my records. The documentation was even better than I'd hoped. Every payment tracked, every contribution noted, including a $10,000 check I'd written for the house down payment that Brandon had promised to repay and never had. The accountant calculated my total investment in the property at just over $87,000 across 6 years. With reasonable interest and adjustment for market appreciation, my claim could exceed $150,000. Margaret filed the claim quietly, through proper legal channels, ensuring Brandon would receive notification by certified mail. Meanwhile, Dr. Vance updated me on Marcus's progress. The treatment was working beyond their most optimistic projections. The boy's white blood cell counts were normalizing. His grandfather had personally called to thank me, his voice breaking with emotion as he described watching his grandson eat solid food for the first time in weeks. That call reminded me why I was doing this. Not just to punish Brandon, though that was certainly part of it, but to protect what I'd created. To ensure that this incredible accident of genetics I'd been born with would continue benefiting children like Marcus instead of funding Ashley's designer shopping habits or Brandon's doomed real estate schemes. Patricia checked in daily, helping me understand the investment strategies she'd recommended. The majority of my wealth would be in conservative, diversified holdings that would generate income without risk, enough to live comfortably forever, with substantial amounts allocated to charity and the kids' trust. On the 5th day after Brandon's visit, Margaret received confirmation that he'd received the financial claim. His attorney called within an hour, spluttering about the timing and implying I was trying to exploit my sudden wealth to hurt my own son. Margaret's response was clinical and devastating. She recited the dates I'd made payments, the amounts, the documentation trail. She noted that Brandon's refinancing had occurred after my job loss and that he'd explicitly expelled me from the residence where I'd invested significant capital. She mentioned that my client, me, was prepared to pursue full legal remedies, including potential fraud claims about the original down payment loan. Brandon's lawyer said they'd need to review their options. Margaret told him they had 48 hours before we filed additional motions. She hung up and turned to me. The real question, she said, was what I wanted to happen when Brandon inevitably came back. I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted him to see what he'd thrown away in that snowstorm. I wanted him to understand that the woman he deemed worthless had always been valuable. He'd just been too blind to see it, and I wanted him to know it in front of witnesses. Brandon called 17 times before I finally answered. His voicemails progressed from confused to angry to desperate, a spectrum of emotion that might have moved me once. Now I listened to each one with the detachment of someone analyzing data points. When I did pick up, I kept my voice calm. I told him I'd had time to think about his suggestions regarding the property and the power of attorney. I said I wanted to discuss everything properly, with everyone present. I suggested a family meeting at the hospital where we could lay everything out clearly. Brandon jumped at the chance. He asked if this meant I'd reconsidered the legal claim Margaret had filed. I told him we'd discuss that too, that I wanted to find solutions that worked for everyone. He believed me. Or maybe he just believed what he needed to believe, that I was still the compliant mother who'd spent 6 years subsidizing his lifestyle without complaint. I scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m., the same time he'd visited before. But this time, I arranged for witnesses. Margaret would be there, naturally. Patricia Chen agreed to attend as well, explaining that financial discussions should include proper representation. I also invited Dr. Vance, framing it as an update on my medical status, and the hospital administrator who'd been liaising with the Billionaires Research Fund. Then I made one more call, to the Tribune reporter who'd written the original story about my blood donation. I told her there might be an interesting follow-up about family dynamics and sudden wealth. She asked if she could bring a photographer. I said yes. The days before the meeting, I spent time with the documents Margaret had prepared. She'd created a comprehensive presentation showing exactly where every dollar of my money had gone, both before and after my wealth. The trust terms, the kids' fund, the charitable donations I'd authorized. She'd also prepared a separate document outlining Brandon's financial situation, information she'd obtained through legal discovery. He and Ashley were deeper in debt than I'd imagined. The refinancing had barely kept them afloat, and they were carrying credit card balances that made my logistics salary look substantial. The Lake Forest property they'd wanted to buy? They'd already put down a non-refundable deposit using borrowed money, betting on my cooperation. Margaret showed me text messages between Brandon and Ashley that his attorney had been forced to turn over. Messages about how they'd handle the situation once they had power of attorney, plans for what they'd buy first, calculations about whether they could convince me to sign over the entire $8 million up front. One text from Ashley made me close my eyes for a long moment. She'd written, "Your mom is so desperate for approval, she'll agree to anything if we make her think it's for the grandkids." She'd been right about the desperation, just wrong about the direction it would take me. I also spent time reviewing the medical updates. Marcus had been discharged from the hospital. His grandfather had donated $2 million to the pediatric oncology ward in my name without asking my permission, simply as gratitude. Dr. Vance showed me photos the family had sent. A small boy with a brilliant smile, color returning to his cheeks, holding a baseball glove. That boy was alive because of something in my blood, something I'd carried through 32 years of corporate drudgery, through raising Brandon alone after my husband's heart attack, through nights of stretching paychecks and years of putting everyone else's needs first. Brandon had looked at me and seen a burden. Marcus's family had looked at my blood and seen salvation. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Patricia helped me finalize arrangements for what would happen after the meeting. I'd already put a deposit on a condo in the Gold Coast neighborhood, a place with 24-hour security and views that made the hospital room look cramped. The building had a name that whispered old money. The Chesterfield. I'd also connected with the shelter where I'd spent those 3 nights. Their director, a woman named Carmen who'd checked on me every morning, had nearly cried when I called. I'd asked about their funding situation, their wish list, what they needed most. She'd sent me a document that detailed everything from bed upgrades to kitchen expansions to salary increases for overworked staff. I'd authorized a donation that would cover every item on that list and add an emergency fund for the next 5 years. Carmen had asked if I wanted naming rights, some kind of recognition. I told her no. I just wanted people who ended up there during Chicago's brutal winters to have better than what I'd experienced. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Not the hospital gown I'd been wearing. Margaret had arranged for professional attire to be delivered. Navy blue suit, elegant but not ostentatious. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman in full control of her faculties and her finances. I checked my reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror. 66 years looked back at me, every line earned, every gray hair a testament to survival. Brandon had bet on me being desperate enough to accept anything. He was about to learn that desperation and dignity weren't the same thing, and the difference between them was worth exactly $8 million. The hospital conference room had windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. Margaret arrived first, setting up documents in neat stacks across the polished table. Patricia followed with her tablet, organizing financial displays. Dr. Vance came next, bringing updated medical reports about the ongoing research and Marcus's continued recovery. The hospital administrator, a man named Robert Chen, no relation to Patricia, joined us to discuss the Foundation's interest in my continued participation. He mentioned that 3 other children with the same rare leukemia variant had been identified as potential treatment candidates, pending my willingness to continue donations. I told him I'd already decided to continue. This wasn't about the money anymore. It never really had been. The Tribune reporter Jennifer Walsh arrived 15 minutes early. She'd brought a photographer named Marcus, a coincidence that made Dr. Vance smile sadly, and asked permission to record the meeting. I agreed, with the caveat that nothing would be published without my final approval. Jennifer had done her homework. She'd researched Brandon's social media, found photos of the Lincoln Park house, tracked property records showing the refinancing date. She'd even found the weather reports from the blizzard day, documenting that the temperature had indeed dropped to 12 below, with wind chills reaching -25. She asked if I was sure I wanted to do this publicly. I told her I'd spent 66 years being sure about things that mattered. This mattered. Brandon and Ashley arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. Brandon's lawyer accompanied them, a younger man who looked uncomfortable the moment he saw the assembled group. Ashley wore an outfit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month, and I recognized her bag from a magazine spread I'd seen in the hospital waiting room. $4,000 for leather and a logo. Brandon's face went through several expressions when he saw the reporters. Confusion, then recognition, then something close to panic before he managed to smooth it into a smile. He tried to take control immediately, suggesting this was supposed to be a private family discussion, questioning why outsiders were present. Margaret introduced herself as my attorney, Patricia as my financial advisor, Robert as the hospital's representative. Jennifer identified herself as press. Brandon's lawyer immediately objected, saying nothing could be on record without prior agreement. I spoke for the first time since they'd entered. I told Brandon that everything about my situation had already been made public, from my job loss to my blood type to my financial windfall. I said I wanted our family discussion to be transparent, given that he'd expressed such concern for my well-being and cognitive function. Ashley's face tightened at that last phrase. Margaret took over, her voice professionally neutral. She began with a summary of my contributions to Brandon's household over 6 years. Every payment was listed with dates and amounts. The down payment loan never repaid. The monthly rent contributions always on time. The utility payments I'd covered. The groceries I'd bought. The childcare hours I'd provided, calculated at market rate for professional nanny services in the Chicago area. Brandon interrupted, saying those were family contributions, not business transactions. Margaret asked if he had documentation showing any agreement that these were gifts rather than investments or loans. He didn't, she continued. The refinancing that occurred 4 days after my job loss. The absence of any discussion about equity sharing despite my substantial financial investment. The decision to expel me from the residence during a winter storm emergency when temperatures reached life-threatening levels. Jennifer was taking notes furiously. The photographer's camera clicked periodically. Ashley tried to interject, claiming I'd wanted to visit my sister, that they'd tried to help me make arrangements. Margaret produced phone records showing I'd never called my sister that day, plus a statement from my sister confirming she'd been in Florida and unreachable. Brandon's lawyer requested a break. Margaret denied it politely, saying we'd only just started. Patricia displayed financial projections on her tablet, showing what Brandon and Ashley had likely planned. The Lake Forest property purchase using my assets. The power of attorney that would have given Brandon control over disbursements. The timeline that would have resulted in my wealth being depleted within 3 years while their debt balances were cleared. She showed their current financial status, numbers that made Ashley go pale. Then she showed the deposit they'd placed on that property, money they didn't have, gambling on access to my accounts. Brandon started talking, his voice rising. He said I was being vindictive, that I was punishing him for one stressed mistake during a storm. He claimed I didn't understand what I was doing, that these lawyers were manipulating me, taking advantage of my age and recent trauma. That's when Dr. Vance spoke up. She described the cognitive tests I'd undergone as part of the medical screening. She noted that my scores placed me in the 97th percentile for my age group. She mentioned my perfect recollection of medical instructions, my clear understanding of complex legal documents, my ability to make informed decisions about my care and finances. She said, quite clearly, that there was absolutely no indication of cognitive decline or incompetence. The room went very quiet. Margaret looked at Brandon with an expression that reminded me of winter ice on Lake Michigan, beautiful and absolutely unforgiving. She asked if he'd like to continue discussing power of attorney arrangements. I stood up from my chair, and everyone's attention shifted to me. Margaret had coached me on this moment, but the words I'd planned felt inadequate for what I needed to say. So I spoke from the place Brandon had tried to bury in that snowstorm. I started with the day I got fired. How I'd sat in that parking lot in Naperville, watching people younger than my son walk past my car, wondering how I'd explain to Brandon that I'd lost the income keeping his refinancing viable. I described the drive back, the rehearsed speeches I'd run through, the hope that maybe we'd figure something out together. Brandon tried to interrupt. Margaret raised her hand, silencing him with a look. I talked about that conversation in the Lincoln Park house. How he'd calculated my value in seconds, reducing 3 decades of my work and 6 years of my financial support to a simple equation. No income equals no worth. I repeated what Ashley had said about the master suite, about me not deserving space if I couldn't pay for it. Ashley opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Then I described the blizzard, the suitcases Brandon had packed without asking what I might need, the Uber ride he'd arranged without verifying where I'd actually be going. Standing on that sidewalk, watching the house lights go dark while the temperature dropped to 12 below zero, I told them about the shelter, the cot between 2 strangers, the fluorescent lights that never quite turned off, the smell of too many desperate people in too small a space, the realization that my son had valued me less than the monthly rent payment I'd been providing. Jennifer's pen moved across her notepad. The photographer's camera clicked. Then I shifted tone. I described Dr. Vance approaching me in that shelter, the blood draw that seemed routine, the return visit that changed everything. I talked about learning my blood type, about understanding that something I'd been born with could save children's lives. I explained the research, Marcus's diagnosis, the treatment protocol. Dr. Vance jumped in with medical details, explaining how rare the antibody combination was, how it opened possibilities for developing therapies that could help dozens of children annually. I watched Brandon's face as the full scope became clear. His grandmother had died of cancer when he was 12. He'd written about it in college application essays, talked about becoming a doctor before settling into business school instead. Now he was processing that his mother, the woman he'd expelled during a blizzard, was using her blood to save children from similar deaths. The $8 million wasn't a lottery win. It was compensation for committing to years of donations, for allowing my body to be part of ongoing research, for giving up privacy and autonomy in service of medical advancement. I pulled out copies of the trust documents Margaret had prepared. I walked Brandon through every detail. The revocable trust in my name only, protecting my assets from anyone seeking access or control. The investment strategy designed for sustainable income rather than flashy returns. Then I showed him the trust fund documents for Leo and Chloe. $500,000 each, held until age 25, with strict conditions. Educational achievement or steady employment. No parental access under any circumstances, no loans, no early distributions, no exceptions. I explained that his children would have opportunities he'd tried to steal from me. They'd have security, education funding, and a foundation to build their own lives. But they'd earn it by becoming adults who contributed to society, not by inheriting money their father had manipulated from their grandmother. Brandon stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He demanded to know about his inheritance, about what I planned to leave him. Margaret handed him a document. My will, freshly drafted and notarized. The relevant section was highlighted. I was leaving Brandon $1. The rest of my estate, after the trusts for Leo and Chloe, would be divided between medical research charities and the homeless shelter where I'd spent those 3 nights. There was a specific bequest for Carmen's emergency fund, ensuring no one would ever be turned away during Chicago's brutal winters. The will included a detailed explanation. I'd listed every contribution I'd made to Brandon's life and household. I'd noted the refinancing, the eviction, the 3 nights in a shelter. I'd documented his attempt to establish power of attorney under pretense of cognitive decline, and I'd stated clearly that Brandon had already received his inheritance. He'd received it over 6 years of me subsidizing his lifestyle, over decades of me raising him alone after his father died, over the countless sacrifices parents make believing their children will honor that love. He'd repaid it by putting me out in a snowstorm. Ashley started crying, mascara running down her cheeks. She talked about the deposit on the Lake Forest property, about how they'd lose everything. She actually said that they'd counted on this money, that it wasn't fair to change the plans now. Patricia spoke up then, her voice crisp. She explained that Brandon and Ashley's financial planning wasn't my responsibility. Their debts weren't my problem. Their inability to live within their means wasn't something I needed to enable. She noted that the financial claim Margaret had filed was still active. I could pursue reimbursement for the $87,000 I'd invested in their house, plus interest. Or I could waive the claim as a final gesture of generosity. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. Tried to find the boy I'd raised somewhere in this man who'd valued me at 0. I told Margaret to waive the claim. I said Brandon should keep the house and everything in it. After all, he'd already taken 6 years of my life and income. What was $87,000 more? But I wanted him to understand something. Every time he walked through that house, every time he saw the rooms I'd helped pay for, I wanted him to remember. I wanted him to think about his mother standing in a blizzard, suitcases in hand, watching those lights go dark. And I wanted him to know that the woman he'd thrown away had been worth $8 million all along. The story ran in the Tribune 3 days later. Jennifer had done exactly what I'd hoped. She'd presented the facts without melodrama, letting the timeline speak for itself. Job loss, eviction during blizzard, shelter stay, medical discovery, family reunion attempt, legal protection, public confrontation. The response was immediate. Local news picked it up. Then national outlets. My phone became unusable, so I changed the number and gave it only to people who mattered. Margaret, Patricia, Dr. Vance, Carmen from the shelter. Brandon tried to call through the hospital switchboard. Robert Chen's office politely informed him that I wasn't accepting contact from family members at this time. Ashley posted something on social media about misunderstandings and media distortion. The comments section tore her apart. People found the photos she'd posted of expensive purchases during the same weeks I'd been in a shelter. Someone calculated the cost of her handbags against Chicago's minimum wage. Brandon's employer apparently suggested he take a leave of absence after his co-workers started recognizing him from news coverage. The Lincoln Park house went on the market within 2 weeks. I heard through Patricia's network that they'd had to accept an offer below asking price to cover the mounting debts. I didn't take pleasure in their downfall, not exactly, but I didn't mourn it either. Leo and Chloe, I'd arranged for them to continue their education at their current school through a separate trust that paid tuition directly. Brandon couldn't touch it, but the kids wouldn't suffer for their parents' choices. I'd also set up regular counseling sessions for them, paid through the trust, with a therapist who specialized in family transitions. They didn't understand everything now, but one day, when they turned 25 and accessed their funds, they'd read the letters I'd written explaining what happened and why. They'd understand that their grandmother had loved them enough to protect them from their parents' mistakes. Marcus's family invited me to their home in Winnetka for dinner. I met the boy who'd been saved by my blood, a bright 8-year-old who showed me his baseball card collection and told me about his plans to become a marine biologist. His grandfather, who'd made his billions in software, talked about legacy and meaning in ways that suggested he'd been thinking a lot about both. He asked if I'd consider joining the board of his medical research foundation. I told him I'd never been on a board in my life, had no experience with that world. He said that's exactly why he wanted me. The foundation needed voices that understood what it meant to struggle, to be overlooked, to survive systems that weren't designed for people like us. I said yes. The condo in Gold Coast became mine in early March. 20th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, showing the Chicago skyline and the lake beyond. 2 bedrooms, one for me, one converted into an office where I could work with the various causes I'd begun supporting. I hired Carmen away from the shelter to help manage my charitable giving. She knew the networks, understood which organizations were efficient and which ones wasted resources on overhead. Together, we built a portfolio of support that focused on housing insecurity, job retraining for older workers, and medical research. The plasma donations continued monthly. Dr. Vance kept me updated on the research progress. 2 more children had begun treatment protocols using antibodies derived from my blood. Both were responding positively. The Billionaires Fund expanded its scope, looking for other rare blood types, building a network of donors who could contribute to specialized treatments. My face became associated with that research. I did interviews carefully, always bringing the focus back to the children being saved, the medical teams doing the work, the importance of blood donation and medical research funding. I never mentioned Brandon by name in those interviews, but reporters always found ways to reference family estrangement and personal betrayals. I didn't confirm or deny. The public record spoke clearly enough. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly, with false starts and backward slides. But by late April, the lakefront bloomed with runners and cyclists, and Navy Pier came alive with tourists. I walked that pier one afternoon in May, watching families take photos and children chase seagulls. Somewhere in that crowd could have been another person like me, carrying something valuable in their blood, their bones, their genetic code, never knowing it. Value isn't always visible. That's what Brandon never understood. He'd looked at a 66-year-old unemployed woman and seen only burden, only cost, only someone taking up space in a house he couldn't quite afford. He'd missed that value sometimes hides in the least expected places, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I thought about sending him a message. Something profound about forgiveness or family or the price of cruelty. But words felt insufficient, and I wasn't sure I had forgiveness in me yet. Maybe someday. Maybe when Leo and Chloe turned 25 and read those letters and understood that someone had loved them enough to plan for their futures. For now, I had my condo with its lake views, my work with the foundation, my monthly donations that saved children's lives. I had Carmen's friendship and Patricia's guidance and Margaret's fierce protection. I had purpose beyond being someone's mother or someone's employee or someone's burden. I had my blood, running warm and valuable through my veins, worth more than Brandon would ever understand. The sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow, I'd give another donation. Tomorrow, Marcus's grandfather would call with updates. Tomorrow, Carmen would bring by new grant proposals to review. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in a home that was truly mine, bought with blood that turned out to be liquid gold. But tonight, standing on Navy Pier with the Chicago wind off the lake, I let myself simply be Kimberly Rodriguez. 66 years old, rare blood type, $8 million richer, and finally warm. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, remember, your value isn't determined by what others can see. Sometimes the most precious things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine.